done, what do we need to do, and what will we achieve. Ladies and gentlemen, there's obviously a few sort of broad statements. We're much prosperous now in inclusive nation today than a decade ago, and I'll show you why and how we achieved that. The economy has been expanding rapidly. You'll see our GDP has doubled since 2010. Prosperity is of course shared, because you'll see also, I'll demonstrate to you how we need to be able to include more people in the lives of our society, whether it's through social welfare payments, and indeed being quite creative in terms of social welfare payments. And also in respect of, for example, some of the announcements we made, things like paternity leave, increase in maternity leave, family care leave. These sort of different initiatives actually contribute to the sharing of that prosperity. And of course, in the global stage, we're punching much above our weight. In October of this year, Fiji becomes the chair of all the small states in the World Bank grouping. As you know, we were chair of the G77 plus China. We have been president of COP23. I understand there's some Institute of Accountants conference. They tend to have some interesting topics there. Somebody asked what's the point of being involved in climate change and the presidency of COP23. Of course, they did not realize that as a result of that, we've seen a lot more investment in that space. We've seen, of course, a lot more traffic coming through Fiji, and we need positioning ourselves vis-a-vis many of these international initiatives. You can see the economy over here. Of course, in 1970, our economy, the GDP, was only $0.2 billion, only $200 million. It took us nearly 40 years, or 38 years to be exact, to reach $5.6 billion from 1970 to 2010. But since 2010 till now, we've doubled. 5.6 to 11.3 billion dollars. That's the size of the economy. So in a short period of 10 years, we've actually expanded by record. And the GDP, of course, has doubled. Now, of course, this means a lot more opportunities. You'll see, you can see the manifestation of that, whether it's, number of cars on the road, number of homes being built, number of renovations taking place, number of jobs increase, of course. And of course, it in itself presents new challenges. The reality is that when people become more prosperous, they also tend to buy more consumer goods. You buy more consumer goods, it puts pressure also on your foreign reserves, because we are basically driven by most of the consumption goods we have. Nearly everything that you may be wearing on yourself and your body now comes from overseas. Every single fabric that you have comes from overseas. We don't actually make our own fabric. This thing that I'm holding, everything that I'm holding here comes from overseas. So as people buy more cars, obviously, it puts pressure on our foreign reserves. It puts pressure on the traffic system. So what are the solutions? Where do we want to be in 2025? Vis-a-vis this sort of prosperity that we're experiencing now, and indeed hopefully more prosperity. Now, we talked about 9 years of straight growth. We've never had that in our economic history. We've had 2 times when we had 7 years of consecutive growth, but never 9 years. And what is really interesting is that in the middle of all of this, we had a cyclone that wiped off 1/3 of the value of our GDP, which is Cyclone Winston. 1.3 billion US dollars was wiped off of our GDP. Very, very significant. Notwithstanding that, we've still grown. And of course, this is where we grew only very modestly at 0.4%. And I think over here, some creative policies actually has helped. For example, we help for homes. We saw pumping of, in a very short period of time, a lot of economic activity with people building homes, etc. The fact that FNPF came on board, allowing people to withdraw funds. Of course, some withdrew funds and went off to work Hong Kong 7, but there are others, of course, who genuinely needed access to those funds, and were able to then inject those funds into the economy. That helped us keep our head, if you like, above the 0% level. We project to grow for another 3 years. I'd love to say another 5 years, but normally projections are done for only 3 years. But I think we'll grow at least for the next 5 years, given where we are. I'll go very quickly through this because I understand some questions. Question time after this, and so you can ask more questions in that respect. The trick over here is, of course, very quickly, if we want to grow, we have to ensure that we have a broad-based economic growth. We simply cannot be dependent on just say tourism and sugar, or tourism in one other sector of the economy. We need a broad-based economic growth. And we're trying to achieve that through various policies. But you can see in the primary industry sector, agriculture has grown. Some may argue modestly, at 0.14%. We think there's enormous potential for that. Of course, some of you may not know this, but in Fiji, of course, when you took out agricultural leases previously, whether you leased healthcare land or whether you leased government land, or what we call crown land or state land, you could only get an agricultural lease for 30 years. If you leased the same land, healthcare land or government land, for tourism purposes, you get 99 years. Residential purposes, 99 years. Industrial purposes, 99. Commercial purposes, 99 years. But not for agriculture. This is why you do not see large-scale investment in agriculture in Fiji. Only those people who, for example, may have freehold land or may have secured some 99-year lease are able to actually put in, for example, go to a bank and borrow money on that land. In fact, the banks, I would also say, as I've said this previously, have also not come to the party. Mainstream commercial banks do not lend in the agricultural sector, period. Generally, the burden is borne by FDD. Which of course is not a good space also. I mean, you go to a country like Australia, you have mainstream commercial banks lending in the agricultural sector. In Fiji, they don't. They need to change the culture. One may argue the reason why they have not been doing so is because they cannot get a secure mortgage over the land. The laws, of course, have now changed, have been changed. So you can actually go and get a agricultural lease for 99 years with the Itaukei Lands Trust Board. You can get it with the state land, through the land department. Of course, many people working in those organizations still have to make that cultural shift. They have not done so themselves. Of course, you now have a constitutional provision that says the landowners, whoever it is that you're leasing the land from, must be paid market rent. Because on the flip side, of course, many lessees have this mentality that if they're going to lease land for agricultural purposes, they should pay almost peppercorn rent. But we must value the land. We must ensure that the landowners actually get market rental for that, and everybody benefits from that perspective. So, some of these issues that I'm highlighting to you are the issues that we need to overcome and make a cultural shift, including the banks, the landowners, the TLTVs, the land departments, and indeed the farmers themselves, the lessees who want to lease the land. They all need to make a shift in their mind in the way that they think for us to be able to, expand rapidly. Fisheries, again, very modest. Forestry, in fact, negative growth. If you see in the industry sector, manufacturing, of course, is quite significant. Construction, again, is significant, and that sort of goes without saying. It also presents a number of challenges. We actually have highly skilled tradespeople in Fiji now coming from Philippines, Bangladesh, Indonesia, because there's a shortage of people. In fact, the Nadi airport renovation, whilst it was a JV, as far as construction is concerned, Peter Hawkins from New Zealand, and PBS here, we had pilots from Samoa done work in New Zealand. They are the ones actually did the tiling at Nadi airport. So we need to also be able to, from a government policy perspective, we need to be able to think beyond Fiji too. We live in a globalized world. If we want to grow rapidly, we need to be able to think that we need to source some of our resources, including human capital, from offshore. Of course, there's some politicians that are very xenophobic about things like this. But this is why they're not good for us. We need to be able to ensure that people think beyond the borders. Because ultimately, the objective should be to grow the Fijian economy and provide what we call deep wealth. This is an enormous area for growth, which is the service sector. We think from a government policy perspective, you'll see the amount of investment we're doing in the ICT sector. There's a lot of jobs that can be created in this sector. We have the financial services, you can see here, 0.4, transport, wholesale, retail. Again, very significant accommodation, information, communication. public administration, of course, with a level of government investments, education, again, another opportunity for us. We now have 3 universities in Fiji. 2 of them are quite significantly sized universities. Recently we had people visiting from other Pacific Island countries, and indeed looking at sending more of the students to Fiji to ensure that, they get those skill sets, but also for us it provides a number of economic opportunities. If you go to countries like Australia and New Zealand, the education sector is now a significant sector in terms of the input from offshore students. So, the economy is more diversified. There's new growth sectors that we've seen. Private sector investments, interestingly, have increased from 11% of GDP in 2007 to 18% of GDP, grown by about 6%. External sector is strong and foreign reserves are above $2 billion. In 2006, foreign reserves were about $500 million. Today it's $2 billion. International benchmark shows that you should have at least 4 months worth of trading in your foreign reserves. When I say there's a country that's very heavily dependent on imports, we need to ensure that the foreign reserves are healthy. But what is really interesting, which is, again, some may say a bit of a quandary, is as you empower people more, there's a lot more pressure on foreign reserves. I'll give you an example. We're spending, for example, in this year's budget, $50 million in rural electrification. Now, every day somebody in Fiji is getting connected to the grid, or standalone microwave, standalone sort of solar systems. Now, the moment somebody gets connected to the grid, they're going to buy a fridge, they buy a microwave machine, they buy a washing machine, they buy a stereo, they get more mobile phones. All of these amenities are bought, or white goods, as we call it. None of these things are made in Fiji. So it puts pressure on our foreign reserves. The moment you connect people to that type of infrastructure. As I mentioned, our unemployment rate has now been the lowest in the past 20 years. Unemployment rate is 4.5%. These are the RBF job advertisement surveys. Up to 2014, they were only measuring job advertisements in the Fiji Times, but now the Fiji Sun, because some people emphasize either one or them, or both of them. You can see the job advertisement rate has gone up. Which is interesting over here too. The number of new compulsory membership in FNPF in 2017 was 20,795, generally an indication of the number of people joining the formal workforce. It's only what we call a formal workforce. There's over 130,000 Fijians who are actually in the informal workforce. People who sell stuff by the roadside. There's over 130,000 people who actually work for themselves. They're not registered with FNPF. Last night I was in a squatter area in Tamagua, and there's a lot of people over there who actually live in Tamagua and Amati Heights area, but they sell vegetables at the market. And we were talking about the new housing grants the government's offered. She said, but we don't have it here because she's self-employed. But they have a regular income. They earn good income, some of them. But they won't be captured by this. These are the people who actually get formal employment. You can see it increased by 20,795. Previous year, 20,553. Of course, if you take off those people who completely withdrawn from FNPF, you get a net membership of 13,000 in 2017. So, what have we done? It's more about vision, leadership, and ability to deliver. What is really critical, and people do not necessarily understand this, when you have the legal framework that makes people feel a lot more comfortable in terms of their rights, then you'll find a lot more buy-in to the system. Many people would say that they have migrated from Fiji because perhaps of political upheaval, but a lot of people also migrate because of the fact that they feel they don't necessarily get equal opportunity, in particular young people. At one stage in Fiji, a lot of parents' objective was to get their kids educated and send them away to Australia and New Zealand. The Aussies and Kiwis actually have been the beneficiaries of well-educated Fijians. Of course, it's another issue that we can talk about. But the fact of the matter is that we need to ensure that the legal framework is there, is consistent. The fact that people get to be called Fijians, I think is very, very important. Many people think that. The fact that we now also have opened up our citizenship, we've seen a lot of Fijians or former Fijians who are now regaining their citizenship and actually wanting to come and invest in Fiji. We've had some people recently who have sort of come back, they want to build their holiday home because they want to escape the winter of North America, the winter of Australia. Some of them become very affluent. So they want to use that money, we welcome them to open house. It creates, of course, a lot more economic activity for us. But the environment must be stable. The environment must be consistent in respect of the policies that are rolled out. Now, we need to be open-minded about things. It's very important, from a philosophical perspective. I was recently, a few days ago, just on the other side at the Holiday Inn, where the ESP had a 2-day session on research and development, where I sort of mentioned to them that in Fiji, unfortunately, our ability to do critical analysis is actually very, very limited. Whenever we do critical analysis, people's views are, well, which political spectrum do you belong to? Which political party are you supporting? We do not have that level of, unfortunately, one may say, political maturity or indeed professional maturity. They are limited on a number of occasions. We do not get some accountant, for example, standing up before the budget is presented, or after the budget is presented, or some legal person, or some other person from any profession who may be good at that profession, whether even is an architect, standing up and giving their analysis or their take on a particular policy that has been rolled out. We do not get that. Of course, some profess to be commentators or experts, but essentially have a particular political proclivity. We do not get objective analysis. Even accountants, I can say. Whenever they say, oh, this person supports that political party, or doesn't like that political party. We really lack that. And that kind of intellectual rigor and intellectual input and professional rigor and professional input is lacking. What we need, we are desperate for it. And hopefully the young people here can actually provide it. Because most certainly the older ones are actually failing us. So even in the academia, as we said again openly, many economists, they simply have a particular point of view because every time a particular government is in government, political party government, they'll always criticize it. Or they'll always say this is wonderful. But we need that level of independence to be able to provide that level of good critical analysis. But again, as we said earlier on in the introduction about open-mindedness, about adopting technology is very, very important. Now, as we've said, that there needs to be, a balance between economic growth and, of course, the social policies that are designed. Recently, there's a World Bank study that was done that looked at the inequality in countries, look at the Gini coefficient, etc. Inequality in Fiji has dropped. We're one of the 5 countries in the Asia-Pacific region where inequality has actually dropped. Now, when we talk, for example, about things like recently, just to take a step back, recently, the minimum wage has become the new political debate. Everybody now will talk about minimum wage. Of course, minimum wage, we talk about minimum wage in this context, is only for unskilled workforce. And there are some people claiming that if they come into power, they'll have minimum wage of $10 an hour. Some people are claiming $5 an hour. Some people are claiming $4 an hour. But what we need to be able to ensure is that we actually do measure, for example, a person's ability to access services. We need to look at things like social wages. It's easy only a few years ago, if you wanted to send your children to school, you had to pay the school fees. If you came from low-income families, you actually had to pay for the bus fare. You had to buy the textbooks. All of these issues we need to take into account. So, you see, economic growth is great, but we have to also make sure on the other flip side that people who are on the margins of society actually brought into society. And you can be actually creative about it. the very rudimentary way of dealing with things, well, just increase salaries. And we can see some countries, including countries like Australia, have actually suffered from, unrestricted wage rise in many areas, the loss of jobs, loss of, in fact, entire industries to various other regions in the world. We do not have the luxury of being a continent like Australia. We do not have the luxury of having a population of 20 million Romans, 20 million people, sorry. Many people would argue that our population base is actually too low. We're not even 1 million people. Mauritius, where I went with Andre and Shanaz this last year. Andre comes from Mauritius, so that is the last where we worked. Much smaller. In fact, the land mass of Mauritius, the entire country, is over 2,000 square kilometers. Big 11 is, to put in perspective, 10,000 square kilometers. But their population is about 1.3 million people. We're not even 1 million. In fact, we're not even 900,000. So of course it puts pressure in respect of our consumption rate, it puts pressure in respect of our skill sets that are available in a smaller pool of people that we can source resources from. Of course, we have to be also strategic and have targeted public investments to modernize our infrastructure. And it's very, very important. You still have some people in Fiji who are drinking from creeks. Some people are drinking from wells with tadpoles in it. Of course, now some people don't even have the wells because they've dried up because of climate change. And some people are still ignoring and say there's no climate change. So, you see, we need to be able to ensure that all these people are actually connected, have basic access to water, electricity, access to transportation, which are also included, of course, in the Constitution. Digital connectivity is very, very important because we don't have cherry picking to take place. Just because the bulk of the population is in the Nosori Islamic corridor and the urban and peri-urban areas of Lautoka, Nadi, and Sigatoka and Labasa, doesn't mean the kid who's actually studying in some remote village in Kandawu or Laos should miss out on the digital upgrade that's taking place, should miss out on the bandwidth, should miss out on the speeds, should miss out on the access to technology. Because then you're actually creating a lot more disequality in society. Everybody says digital era is a great equalizer, but it can be the greatest disequalizer if you don't ensure that everybody has access to it. This is why we have, and I'll talk about later on, things like access to wireless, access to digital connectivity, etc. Human capital development is very, very important. And of course, it's seen in the budget we've announced now, our government is giving out more scholarships based on merit and also based on the required skill sets. We, for example, do not give the Topper scholarship to lawyers. There are too many lawyers. But there's a huge shortage of town planners, surveyors, marine scientists, foresters, nurses, engineers, doctors, specialists. All of those areas. We don't even have a speech therapist, a speech therapist. If any one of you, God forbid, has a heart attack now, there's not a single Fijian doctor that can carry out open heart surgery on you. Not one. Which is really a shame in the 21st century. You, of course, cannot turn an open heart surgeon overnight. Just because I've done MBBS doesn't mean I can cut you open and play with your heart. I need 10, 15 years of experience. Exposure. So these are the skills, these are the challenges we have. And we need to understand that. How we position ourselves in that respect. Of course, many people don't talk about this because they're very difficult subjects they consider. And of course, we've announced various scholarships for that. We've said, for example, civil servants we offer 5 PhDs for civil servants, 5 PhDs for people in the private sector. Even though they may not actually work for government, they will also get those PhDs and also masters. Maintaining stability is very, very important. If you look at most countries in the world that have actually gained deep economic wealth, whether you look at countries like Australia, New Zealand, USA, and Europe, they've all had, in the earlier periods, very deep periods of stability, long periods of stability. And there's been consistency in policies, not chop and change every 4 years, 5 years, even 10 years for that matter. So that ability to have deep economic growth and deep wealth must or cannot be achieved if you do not have stability. I don't just mean physical stability or law and order stability, I also mean in terms of economic policies. They need to be driven by growth, driven by a particular vision. Everybody loves running like Singapore. I mean, it's still ruled by one party, it's independence. I'm not saying this is the case indeed. It'd be a good thing for a period of time, but you know, the fact of the matter is that they have been able to position themselves because they have a vision. We import all our fuel from Singapore. Singapore does not produce a single ounce of oil. But they're very clever about it. They knew that they were next to a largely populated region. They decided to refine fuel, and now we're buying all our fuel from them. When the Singapore military wants to go into jungle training, you can hire a jungle from Indonesia. It's a city-state. But they've been able to achieve many things, but also make some hard decisions. Till today, you cannot buy chewing gum in Singapore. Back in the 1960s, they decided it was a bad habit. It dirties the environment. I'm not saying let's ban chewing gum in Singapore, very please. But you see, you need to make certain decisions. You need to make certain tough decisions now to be able to achieve benefits in the future. And unfortunately, I think many businesses don't want to do this. It's not, I always get a bit worried whenever I come to these gatherings or other gatherings, not just this one. There always seems to be a dichotomous approach to how we want to achieve certain things in our economy in 5, 10 years' time. So it's like, well, government must work with business, business must work with government. But in fact, many businesses need to look at themselves in the first place. How are they doing business with themselves? Are they adopting technology themselves or not? And I think that inability to look inwards has restricted the private sector in peace. There's always been a dichotomous approach to business and government. Just very quickly, look at tax rates in Fiji. In 2000, corporate tax was 35%. Today it's 20%. In 1974, 1985, we paid tax. Threshold was 50%. Tax starting from $600. Can you imagine paying tax after you have more than $600 a year? Today, of course, you don't pay any tax until you earn $30,000. Huge difference. But what is really interesting, of course, we're collecting more revenue in tax. I think we can collect a lot more because everybody starts paying their taxes correctly. We still have a lot of leakage. Still a lot of people trying to game the system. We need the gaming to stop because the reality of the matter is the tax rate is very low. And we need everybody to work on board with this. Many, as I've said, if you go to countries like Singapore, just using that, if you talk to many professionals, it would appear to me when I spoke with them that the first and foremost fiduciary duty that appeared to me is actually to their country, then to their clients. This is what, in a way, legally speaking, of course, your fiduciary duty is to your clients. But the unwritten fiduciary duty is to their country. And I wish many of you could become like that. Frankly, I see that all the time. Even in some of the submissions that are being made by accounting firms or law firms and various other people, or even businesses for that matter, making submissions to Joe and his team. Is always trying to game the system because they put their clients ahead, even though they may know perhaps may be breaching the law. Or in a way circumventing the law. The reality is that we need everybody to ensure to work together to improve the capacity of the country. You don't have gold 2 feet underneath the ground and gold coming out of the earth. We don't have fuel or oil in the black waters. You don't have that. So we need to be creative, and creativity also means that we need to be able to ensure that we first and foremost put the laws of the land ahead of everything else. Of course, we've done things like no dividend taxes, we've done targeted investments in the ICT area, tourism, SMEs and housing. There's a lot more to be done, of course, there. Again, just very, very quickly, you can see the investments that are taking place as far as roads, bridges and jetties are concerned. We've got FRA speaking to you later on. And of course, the numerous challenges too. The reality is that for decades, Fiji did not have a good maintenance plan in place. In fact, they did not even have one. And I'm sure Jonathan mentioned that to you too. People think in Fiji, once you pass the road, that's it. You actually have to come back and receive those roads on a regular basis, because the biggest enemy to roads actually creeps in, which is water. We have roads that were being built with water pipes being put directly underneath the road. And there's leakage in the pipe, we dig up the road, to the water pipe, and we cover up the road. All those sorts of things. Building that smarter. The 4-lane road coming out of Nandi Airport, going to Martin Tower, Marka, etc. You will see there's no overhead cables. Costing us a lot more money, but that's the whole objective. The next time there's a hurricane, there's nothing to blow down. It requires a lot of realignment of infrastructure, etc. Of course, there are many people resisting things like that too. We've seen in Namaka itself, we have to build service lanes, people not wanting to give up, even though they're being paid handsomely for giving up a few meters of their land to get a service lane put in. They don't want to do that, they want to take you to court. Just so they get a little bit of their property sticking out. This is an overall sense of working towards the national good is not there. And of course, the accountants and lawyers are helping them with it too. Which is terrible. They all think it's okay to do that. But ultimately, the country suffers. Everybody talks about, oh, we want to be like Singapore. But look what they did to become like Singapore. It's amazing things like streetlights and footpaths, what they can do to a community. We have seen, for example, many of what we may call growing suburban applications, whether it's, Maro, whether it's Korobuto, and places like that. We're putting streetlights, of course, we'll be putting footpaths, etc. By doing that, people actually feel that they're part and parcel of the growth. But not just that, we're actually increasing the land value in those areas. So now, the Itaukei landowner now can develop the land, get a better pricing for that land. People will be wanting to go and live there, build their home there. They don't, because the cities are becoming more expensive to buy land. So I can actually go and buy a piece of land for Korobuto. I know about streetlights, about supermarkets, with access infrastructure, FA or EFL always works. Those sorts of things, they matter, but it creates economic growth. It spreads the wealth. Again, water and electricity. As I said, the rural education is spending over $50 million. We have subsidized, electricity for those who earn less than $30,000 a year, even those people who pay what we call prepay, who top up through M-Pesa. 80% of the people who have who pay electricity, or prepay electricity, they should top it up through M-Pesa now, which is great. Of course, we zero-rated duty on smartphones a few years back. A lot more people have smartphones, so the ability to access services, etc., is not better. Investing in human capital, again, this is education, very quickly. This is where you saw free education come in. Early childhood education, of course, came on after that. We have primary school education that's completely free, secondary education is completely free. Now we have toppers and, of course, TELS that's available. We've got over $1 billion in this year's expenditure. We've had, for example, schools in Kandahar that were completely destroyed. Some of it, of course, is allocation for that. Over $19 million in capital investment in the education sector. But what we are doing is, again, sort of positions us for years like 2025. In this year's budget, we've allocated some funding to do a stock take of all the schools in Fiji. Most schools in Fiji are actually started up by faith-based organizations, what we call community committees. So people may, for example, in Lomo Mai, may have got together and decide their kids don't have access to school back in 1918 or 1930, decide to set up a school. That committee now still runs the school. Of course, not those people started, but it's passed on. And many of them, for example, run by the Methodist Church, the Catholic Church, the Sanat Dharam, Arya Samaj, Muslim League, Assemblies of God, Seventh-day Adventists. All the teachers in those schools, we pay the salaries. This is the Honourable Prime Minister said at the Methodist Church Conference that we need all these people to be appointed and vetted. We need the best teachers to run the schools. That, of course, is happening. But we don't have an infrastructure stock take of all the schools. So as the committees, for example, got a bit of money, then they built one classroom. Over 95% of all the schools that were damaged in Cyclone Winston did not even have an architectural plan, did not have an engineer's certification. So now when we're building it, we have to build back better. We have to invest in the money. So we're now doing stock take of schools. So then we have a priority list. So which schools will be fixed up first? There's some children, for example, down south of Bua, who live on some of those islands. They actually are in class 1, they go to boarding school on the mainland. Many people don't even have their kids go to boarding school in primary school. But these kids, for them to get education, are going to boarding school. You know, they're away from their parents at a very early age. So these are the issues we have to address. We need to look at the conditions in which they go to these boarding schools. We're doing a stock take of that. So we have a much more better approach to infrastructure development as far as the education sector is concerned. Health, of course, is very important. I don't want to labor on these points, but this is very important for us, public-private partnership for Baja Hospital. As you know, we're working with the IFC, and again, the reason I highlight this is about the services sector. As we said earlier on, we do not have the capacity to have open heart surgery available in Fiji 24/7. We don't have chemotherapy. We don't have full oncological services available in Fiji. We need to improve that. So government came up with a policy that we need to, form a partnership with the private sector. So we've gone through that. We're going through a tender process. We've got site visitations next month. The PS Economy and Siri Gardner from the Ministry of Economy were in India a few weeks ago. A number of people are interested in coming, setting up, providing the services in Fiji. The reason why we've chosen, of course, Lautoka is because it's also closer to the international airport. It's closer to the tourism sector too. And of course, we've got a greenfield project, the Bar Hospital, the new site, capacity to feed into Lautoka was very strategically placed for us. Now, what that means is that we will be able to now offer those services in Fiji. So it stops foreign outflow, foreign reserves outflow. When you go to India, you go to Australia, New Zealand, you take money away. FNPF does not like that either. FNPF will be a partner in this. So we've given it basically to FNPF on a plate. FNPF has come along with it. One of the conditions, of course, they provide, like I said, 24/7 open heart surgery. In fact, the highest killer in Fiji is actually cardiovascular events at the moment. We have high rate of diabetes, but the highest number of deaths that come from actually cardiovascular events. So we'll have that available. We have oncology, we have chemotherapy available. We'll be open, of course, to foreign patients, so the private sector can make some money, the PPP arrangement can make some money from that, so they'll revenue will come to government. One of the conditions also is that they build a new wing at the Lautoka Hospital, which will also include building a modern-day operating theatre. Not that we don't have that at the moment, but to actually even make it a lot better. So we have viewing areas, so students can actually watch, get more of our people trained. It's very difficult to actually keep on sending doctors offshore, but if you actually have the services available here, then they can actually be trained in country to build capacity very quickly. So they'll get a concession on that. But, ladies and gentlemen, what is really important from that is this. If you have full tertiary care available, medical tertiary facilities available in Fiji, it opens up opportunities in the medical services sector, medical tourism. But one other area that's really critically important is retirement villages. I remember prior to 2014, a number of Japanese investors were interested in coming and setting up retirement villages in Fiji. the areas that they did not go ahead with is because of the lack of tertiary medical care available in Fiji. The moment this is available, those of you who are investors, think about these opportunities. I think nearly 3/4 of the Japanese population is very aged. Spend about 3/4 of their budget looking after aged people. You go to last year in Yokohama, you have a 75, 78-year-old attending to you at the supermarket. That's the demographics in Japan. Australia has an aging population. They have challenges in that respect of providing care for aged people. Many Fijians are actually in San Francisco and various other places actually working there in the aged care industry. Some legally, some illegally. The reason why they do that is a huge demand for it. So we need to be able to capitalize on it. What it also means is that we need to get a universities like FNU, more so, and USP, in respect of getting our people to the right level of certification, getting those courses made available in Fiji. So it makes it attractive for investors to come to Fiji and provide a set of retirement, provide aged care facilities in Fiji. But we need to G up all these areas that will actually contribute to that sector. Digital, very quickly, we provided $40 million in the ICT sector in this year's budget. We've, of course, spending $40.6 million. This is, we are working with the Singaporeans, actually. Singaporeans are very, very good, as you know. They're not necessarily cheap, but they're very good. They develop very good products. So a number of the services now will be available on your mobile phones, including title searches, company searches, requires a lot more work in that space. We're working with them. Walisi, as you know, is a platform that's becoming quite large. You can get now free-to-air television anywhere in Fiji, southern people of Laos, Tuma, Vikumpia, inland, Siri. Either you just simply use an aerial, or you get a dish. You don't have to pay monthly subscription. Setting up free Wi-Fi spots. All the FNU campuses are being Wi-Fi with much faster speeds, bigger bandwidth, and we've actually geofenced it. So you go to Sukuna Park now, you sit in Sukuna Park now, you'll actually access, you log on to the digital Fiji platform, you get much faster speed, bandwidth is much broader, you can upload, download very easily, and you can get 1 hour for free. But that's all, creating that ability for people to get used to that technology. Again, over here, this is something we're very keen on. Again, those of you who are professionals, please encourage your clients to do so. We need more electronic transactions in Fiji. The banks have come to the party, I should say. So from the 1st of Jan, you won't have any transaction fee for you if you're going to use your card on the point of sale, or on the point of sale machine. You go to the supermarket, buy worth groceries. Currently, you pay 40 cents for the one transaction, and the merchant pays 30 cents for the transaction. So they make a killing of 70 cents. Of course, the approach of saying that the sponsor is ANZ. But I'm sure ANZ, because we've said that, will make some significant changes very, very soon. But from the 1st of Jan, there won't be any fees for you. So customers will no longer will pay the 40 cents. Issue of the fact that particular Saudi, in fact, has led that initiative. And of course, we're looking at how we can, in fact, incentivize the banks, indeed the merchants, the government that work together with them. And we, in fact, made a budgetary allocation to perhaps provide some form of subsidy to the merchants. So the fees are reduced for the merchants. In particular, the smaller merchants, and not the big boys, but the smaller ones. We need corner shops to have actually POS machines. I can walk into a shop in New Zealand and buy a bottle of water with my ATM card. In Fiji, people save $10. We need to be able to change it. Like I said to the high school students, they want to next time go to the bank to buy a Chinese roll with your ATM card. We need to achieve that status. We're also actually going to subsidize the purchase of POS machines in this year's budget. Costs about 500 Australian dollars, 750 Fijian, and of course we'll provide 50% of that. Again, ladies and gentlemen, just very quickly, how much money we're spending for what we call protecting the ones who are disadvantaged. We're spending a lot of money in that space. As you know, the budget militant, they don't have any formal pension. So they now get $100 a month. And of course, there is other areas. We provide, for example, food vouchers for rural pregnant women. And we want them to obviously eat healthy, so they produce healthy, they eat healthy themselves, less pressure on the medical system too. Now, this is very interesting. This is statistics. I'm sure the government will verify this. This is not pulled out of thin air. If you look at the amount of capital expenditure between 1980 to 2006, which is about 27 years, whichever government was in government, whichever was finance government, they spent $3.5 billion in capital infrastructure, capital expenditure, I should say. And the debt increased by 2.6 billion. From 2007 to this financial year, which is 11 years, we've actually doubled the amount of money spent in 27 years. Debt increased by $2.3 billion, $3.3 billion less. But what is really more interesting is that for every dollar of capex between 1980 and 2006, 76 cents was borrowed. And for every dollar of capex from 2007 to now, only 36 cents is borrowed. Why? Because we have high levels of operating savings. I don't think there's a slide here, but you know, we intend to be budgeted the savings about $1 billion this financial year of operating savings. Last year was about $800 million. This is why we actually use the savings first as capital infrastructure, then whatever we need to borrow, then we borrow out. Many people in Fiji suddenly have become debt experts about national debt. Everybody talks about debt, obviously we talked about debt before. Of course, they don't necessarily understand that. Debt to GDP ratio in Japan is 239.2%. Singapore is 112%, USA 107.4%, Fiji sits at 47%. This is our debt to GDP ratio compared to other countries. Nobody says that these countries are in trouble. Only apparently Fiji seems to be in trouble. Again, a lot of people are obsessed in Fiji about nominal figures, about the actual dollar value. That's the dollar value of the debt. Japan's debt is $11.8 trillion US dollars. Singapore, of course, lesser, but of course, the reason why it's 112% is because the economy is much smaller compared to the USA. So the USA is the most debt-ridden country in the world, $19.9 trillion. Of course, the debt to GDP ratio is 107.4, is lower than Japan, even though Japan's debt is lower than the USA because the Japanese economy, of course, is smaller than the US economy. Canada, 1.4 trillion. We look at sort of comparative countries like Maldives, Seychelles, Nauru, Mauritius. I mean, these people, of course, invested a lot of money in infrastructure. Mauritius did. It's paying the dividends now. Fiji, 2.47 billion US dollars. Again, I mean, as I mentioned earlier on, we need to change our attitude. Changing the attitude is very, very important for the business and government. You know, we have, for example, I'll give you an example. We've had people, we've been investing a lot of money in roads. The very basic example. Investing money in roads, but of course we have trucks that go have overlaying trucks. So LTA is now come in and impose fines, very heavy fines. Those FRA doesn't know about that. They're going to spend millions of dollars a month or it breaks up in 6 months. So we need to have those roads. Like you go to countries like Australia, New Zealand, there are certain roads you can't go over certain colors in those streets. Like, I mean, Bellow Street is not going to be built out with very heavy subbase, etc. Because you don't expect a 20-ton truck or 50-ton truck to be going down Bellow Street. It should be only the feeder roads. But of course, the culture is, I'm a truck driver, I'm going from Missouri to perhaps Saratoga, I've got a cousin who lives in Bellow Street, I pop by for some lunch. So I take my truck down to Bellow Street. See, we need to change this. A lot of people are resistant to this. United guy can lunch. So, for example, at the moment, we have an issue where people have said, you know, they can't in soil, they can't in gravel, etc. They brought in trucks, but they in fact should only be used in mining sites. Those trucks have now been banned. The very deep troughs they have. So now what's actually happening is that when we impose those fines, so people are saying, well, you know, I don't like this. I don't like this. I'm not going to change. My margin rate is going low. Well, guys, invest in traders. Just the same people complain about the road breaking down. You cannot have it both ways. So changing the attitude is also about changing the way we do things, about how we've been doing things, how we accept things, we should change that. Changing business processes, again, that's very much an issue for government, but also for businesses too. You need to change your processes too, how you deal with each other, how much technology you want to take. We need to change our business processes. Just 2 days ago, for example, Ministry of Education. It's the largest ministry, both in terms of expenditure and also in terms of the number of staff. But they're still writing checks, something like 18 checks a day on average. Change all that now, we found a partnership with ANZ, and so now basically electronic funds transfer. So we need all the government ministries to do that. We need to get various processes. There are a number of laws that are still very archaic. Of course, we need the parliamentary committees to keep up with the number of changes to bring about. Many laws are very, very old. We need to change it. In particular, one area that we're quite passionate about is in the area of local government, power and country planning, the engineering requirements, etc. We need to change that. As you know, that we recently brought in, is I think on the next page, we brought in the man who's internationally acclaimed, the architect of Singapore itself, that the town plan for that, Dr. Liu. He's in his 70s or so, but still very sharp. We brought him in to essentially do a blueprint for us, all the municipalities. Our municipalities can be a lot more smarter, can be a lot more better. We've had sort of municipalities, people who run municipalities in the administration side with not necessarily the right skill sets. Development, one may argue, doing sort of really new for a number of decades. So we need to sort of take a stock table, have a stock table there. And be able to sort of, what we call pre-planned planning. We of course have to, revamp and introduce new skill sets. Society is changing. We need some people who may no longer have the right skill sets. We need to be able to train them. We need to ensure that our young people actually have the right skill sets. These are sort of self-explanatory. And of course, you need continuation of policies. You need continuity of policies, I should say. Because many of these policies that we have actually implemented, they're not ended in itself just by delivering on budgets. It needs to continue. There's a momentum. The momentum needs to continue. I've said, put here things like LTA needs to look at things, but LTA, for example, the way in which LTA have done, are they actually doing the collaboration on the scale every 3 months, or are they doing it every 2 years, so people can complain more about that? It's one thing to impose penalties on heavy-laden trucks, but I ensure that you're doing your part. Statutory bodies need to be able to do that too. Digital feature, again, I mentioned that responsible corporates, responsible professionals, I mentioned that also. Again, I already said that what to do. More Itaukei land be more accessible, but at the right price. We need to pay Itaukei landowners the market rate, otherwise they're not going to lend to you. So people need to get rid of this idea that I should be able to get a lease at a cheap rate. It's a 99-year lease. It's a good lease. You can use it as a mortgage. The banks will give you a mortgage. Most of the hotels in Fiji are built on Itaukei land. Banks lend it. And I think maybe the largest lender to the hotel industry. So we need to change our attitude both ways. We need to be able to tell the landowners that it's an asset that's yours. Nobody's taking it away from you. You've got the constitutional protection for that. But use it to generate cash for yourselves. So one of the things had one complaint, for example, some landowners in the province of Mangaroa willing to lend the land, willing to get the market for 1990s for agricultural purposes, but somebody at TLTV was not on board with that. So that's the kind of attitude we need to change. Again, connectivity is very important. Andre is talking to you about Fiji Airways. Fiji Airways is a very exciting entity. Over 90% of all our tourism arrivals come by air. Nearly 70% of the market share is by Fiji Airways. But Fiji Airways is the only airline that flies whenever we have, whatever happens in Fiji. If we have a cyclone, Fiji Airways is the only airline that's flying. Of course, because it's a full cyclone, they don't fly. But as soon as it's over, they will fly, they will fly. The other thing is it's our national carrier. We need to protect our national carrier. Of course, as you know, made a number of changes prior to 2014, and it's actually paid off. And so, we need that connectivity to protect that national carrier also. A lot of people talk about this notion about open skies. Please, you need to park that. They'll kill us. But we're still open-minded, and I'm sure we'll talk about that. And also new technology and new metal in the aircraft. Again, sea connectivity, was talking about the PS, the chair of Port Corporation is talking to you about sea connectivity, and of course, a lot of it is to do with the fact that we need to have good facilities available to be able to attract. Before we partially privatized Fiji Ports Terminal Limited, shipping companies used to charge a levy because of the inefficiency of the port. After 80 Spence came and started off management of Ports Fiji Limited, Ports Terminal Limited, sorry, the levies went and the efficiency of the port increased by 33%. Makes it more attractive as a traffic shipment company. We of course are currently looking at having a completely new location for the port, and we need to be able to build infrastructure around that. We need to have, for example, shipbuilding. We need to be able to have, ship repair works. We have dry dock, slipway. Of course, back in the 1990s, the then government sold shipping company, we had shipbuilding company to $2 New Zealand company. Then bought it back at a high price. These kind of ridiculous decisions that we made. Strategically, we started. But we can take advantage of that. We need to retain more young people. We need to give them the confidence to stay in Fiji. 50% of the population in Fiji is below the age of 27. 50%. 70% of the population is below the age of 40. Those who are below the age of 40 are a minority. And of course, we have a young population, means we will be making more babies. Young population means more babies. So how are we going to shift ourselves? Medical perspective, infrastructure perspective. All of those issues need to be actually talked about and discussed and taken into consideration. But we need to be able to provide the Constitution and the legal framework to be able to have confidence in the system to stay in Fiji. So I can tell you, all the people who migrate from Fiji, in particular the young people, Australia, New Zealand, are key beneficiaries of that. Their intellect, their human capital, those countries are benefiting from it, and we are actually losing out. We don't even have one Fijian actuarial. Not even one Fijian actuarial. FNPF, which is the largest cash reserve, about 38%, does not even have a actuarial. It's really a travesty of justice, just a travesty, that we don't have one Fijian actuarial. People and governments have not thought about this. We're giving now scholarships for people who actually go overseas. If you're an undergraduate student, you come out of high school, you get accepted to actuarial studies. We'll send you and pay everything for you to go and become an actuarial, and then come back to Fiji and have those. And of course, we need to open up a civil service. We encourage a lot more people from the private sector to apply for jobs in the civil service. We actually have people who have done so recently. gentlemen, that's my presentation. And hopefully this provides some food for thought. And I look forward to hearing the other presentation, but I'm quite happy to answer questions whenever the occasion arises. Thank you. Bye.